A very good morning to all of you. In my previous lecture, I talked about Coleridge's views on imagination, and we also understood the two types of imagination that he talks about. We talked about the primary imagination and secondary imagination. In this part of my lecture, I shall be talking about the difference between fancy and imagination. So we are all familiar with Coleridge's Biographia Literaria. We have been talking about chapter 13 from this particular text on criticism, which was published in the year 1817. In this chapter, in this book, actually, he differentiates, he distinguished between fancy and imagination. Now, what is fancy? In Coleridge's view, fancy is a logical way of organizing sensory material without really synthesizing it. So you need to understand that fancy is defined as a logical way of what? Organizing sensory material. Sensory material means whatever you perceive through your sense organs. The sensory data is logically organized in your mind. But this organization does not have the synthesizing quality. To synthesize means to combine them, to blend them together. Means in fancy, this process of synthesizing is missing. It is merely a logical way of organizing sensory material. Means what exactly? When you see something, when you hear something, when you taste something, when you feel the touch of something, or when you smell something, so that particular data material is called sensory material. Let's say you see a flower, you see an animal, you see beautiful nature, and that is stored in your mind. So this storing process is a kind of fancy. It is a logical way of organizing sensory material. But this material, which is organized, let's say there are different compartments in your mind, and these things are kept into that compartment. Now we can take the example of a sentence. Sentence is a logical way of organizing your thoughts. It's presenting your thoughts. In the same manner, fancy organizes whatever you pursue through your senses. Whatever you receive by using your sense organs. But what is missing in this process? The process of synthesis. Synthesis means what? Making it one, combining it together and making it one. And this process is missing in fancy. When we understand fancy in comparison to imagination, imagination is a spontaneous and original act of creation. Okay, it is a spontaneous and original act of creation. So you can understand that fancy is not spontaneous. Fancy is not original. So it is, fancy is liking or desire for someone or something. But this particular desire does not last for long. For example, we fancy for something, but that may not be the permanent desire. So fancy is something that you like, or something you aspire for, you desire for. But this is not long lasting. It does not last for long. So Coleridge regards fancy to be the inferior to imagination. When we talk about fancy and imagination, fancy is not on the level of imagination. Fancy is inferior, of low quality in terms of degree, we can say. It is lower to imagination. Of course, it is a kind of creative power. It's a creative power because by using this, you organize. The mind organizes sensory material. So fancy can be understood as the process of bringing together images dissimilar in the main by source. By source means you see something and then you bring them together. These images are dissimilar. Yesterday, I gave the example of Robert Burns. In his poem, A Red, Red Rose, Robert Burns, let's say, sees a flower, a red rose. So this is an image that he captures in his mind by using his eyes. Through eyes, he takes the picture. So that image that is stored in the mind is a kind of fancy. And then he remembers his beloved. Okay, so both images are there, flower and a lady in his mind. These images are dissimilar. Okay, by source. One is human being and the other is flower. But fancy only combines what it pursues into beautiful shapes. Whereas in the imagination fuses and unifies. Fancy only combines, only less. I was giving you an example of A Red, Red Rose by Robert Burns. So I told you that in that poem, we see the comparison between a red rose and the beloved. So this combination is already there in the mind. The image of the rose and beloved are already images of both these aspects are there. But it is the imagination which fuses and unifies, not fancy. Fancy does not fuse. You must be knowing the term fusion. Fusion means combining, okay, mixing it together, unifying. And fancy only combines. It does not fuse and unify. So the difference between fancy and imagination is same as the difference between a mechanical mixture and a chemical compound. You can take the analogy over here. A mechanical mixture and a chemical compound. Okay. Now, for example, when you blend something in your mixer, you call it mixer, a blender. You can separate the ingredients. Let's say you take coriander, you take ginger and garlic, and you mix them together by using a mixture. But still they can be seen. The presence of a garlic, the presence of ginger or coriander can be seen. It does not become a unified whole. When we take an example of a chemical compound, for example, water, when you add salt into water, sugar into water, and stir it, it will become a chemical compound. And you will not be able to separate them. So here lies the difference between fancy and imagination. So fancy is something like that blended substance. Okay, by using your mixer, it is a kind of blended substance. Whereas imagination is a chemical compound. Because imagination creates new shapes and forms of beauty. How? By fusing and unifying the different impressions it receives from the external world. So a red rose is an imagination. My love is like a red rose. When the poet speaker says that it is imagination, because here a fusion, the unification of different impression has taken place. A red rose and a beloved are two separate things. And we fail to understand what is the poet trying to say without using our poetic sensibility. And then we understand that the poet is comparing his beloved with the beauty of red rose. So what is the common quality here? Beauty. So that is what is imagination. So fancy is a kind of memory. Everything is stored in your mind. A red rose is there, the beloved is there, or different aspects are there. So that is stored in your memory. And then imagination tries to unify it, fuse it. I wandered lonely as a cloud. When Wordsworth says, this is the first line of his poem, Daffodils, I wandered lonely as a cloud. Now you can imagine what has the poet done. Here, the poet compares the speaker with what I is the first person speaker, the poetic persona we can say, compares himself with a cloud. Now what is the best is these are two different things, but they are combined together. This is a chemical compound, you can say. So fancy is a kind of memory. It randomly brings together images, and even when brought together, they continue to retain their separate individual properties. Just now, I gave you the example of the blended mixture. When you grind something, blend something in your mixer, so that is not a chemical compound, because some of the ingredients retain their separate individual properties. You can see the presence of those things. But when it becomes a unified whole, so that is what imagination is. So he talks about this process of interpretation of the senses. So just now we understood that fancy is a mode of memory. And this memory is emancipated, means free from the order of time and space, blended with and modified by that empirical phenomena of the will, choice. Okay. Whereas imagination is to use mind's eye, mind's ear, not your actual eye or actual ear. Through your mind's eye, you see something. Through your mind's ear, you hear something. You hear the sound. Now let me give the example. When you listen to certain onomatopoeic sounds, chum chum chum, for example. So you hear the sound by through your mind's ear. पंछी सुर में गाते हैं, बौरे गुनगुनाते हैं, घुंघरू बजाती है हवा. This is what imagination is. पंछी सुर में गाते हैं. You can hear the sound of birds, chirping birds, through your mind's ear. भौरे गुनगुनाते हैं और घुंघरू बजाती है हवा. So this is what imagination is. Different images are there, stored in your mind, and you mix them together, and they cannot be separated so easily. So this is what imagination is. Okay, so all materials are ready-made from the law of association. but we interpret this material by using our imagination. So through this discussion, we understand that fancy is a kind of power to create memory, mosaics. You might be knowing mosaic. Mosaic is a kind of design in which you come across different pictures. Or collage. I hope you are familiar with the term collage. So fancy is a kind of collage. So rearranging what we have experienced into a new combination of shape to suit our fancy is the function imagination. So imagination is an assemblastic power. Now, Norton, you know what you know Norton's anthology of literary criticism. He is the one who has combined all the essays together. I have given many of essays from this book itself. The PDF version that you come across are from Norton's anthology. So Norton says that the phrase assemblastic power is Coleridge's own coinage. To coin, you might be knowing in linguistics, especially in morphology, the term coinage is used. Coinage means to find a new word, to coin a new word. So assemblastic power is Coleridge's coinage. He was the first to use this term for the first time. And this particular phrase is built from root words, which means that imagination has the power, okay, to mold into unity. Plastic is, molding material. It has the ability to mold. Mold these things into unity, to make it one. So this is how imagination helps us in interpreting the data, sensory data, we can say. So Coleridge talks about all these things in chapter 13. So in chapter 13, we understood that imagination is the mysterious power. There are two types of imaginations: primary imagination and secondary imagination. And then we went on talking about the difference between primary imagination and secondary imagination. Further, we elaborated the difference between fancy and imagination in this lecture. I hope you understood it.